Okay. Thank you. So that I appreciate that clarification.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And then my only other question is, I know Mr. Pate was providing us with some information last meeting about the buckets that are available for this type of funding. So we've got about $15 million in local capital projects fund, and then there were a few different buckets in the general fund that were at about 10.9. We were just hearing from Stantec tonight, and we're waiting until January to talk a little bit more about those needs. But if we're looking at a Pierce or a Prestonwood or a Brentfield or whatever, as well as issues and challenges in the Lake Highlands area, and we have yet to hear from Richardson and Berkner areas, I'm a little concerned about how we cover all of our bases. And again, I see this, I am on board with it, but just looking a little bit further out, want to make sure that we're not spending money that we're going to need for instructional space, because to me the instructional space is the key.
Yeah, that's a good, really good question. So can you first, Mr. Bailey, I think there were a couple pieces there. One, can you talk about, because I think it is important for clarification, talk about of this $50.9 million, what's being paid through bond funds, what's being paid through other funds, and what other funds is that being proposed from?
So Sandra and I will tag team this. Okay. The additional roughly $6 million, $2 million for each of the three MACs, that is the portion that we would need that is not funded from the regular bond program. I believe the total is about $59 million that is in the bond program for the four MACs.
All four.
All four MACs. And it's just this additional piece that's, like I said, $2 million apiece. We're looking for other funding sources. As Ms. Patterson mentioned, we have $14.9 million, almost $15 million in our local capital projects fund that we could use to cover this $6 million. We also have $10.9 set aside in assigned fund balance in the general fund. And so that does not affect our unassigned. We still have the 3 months of unassigned fund balance in the general fund. So you could spend out of either one of those buckets at this point.
And then we have the permanent school fund, which is...
the permanent school fund is $18 million.
Okay. So I'm hearing 9 plus 19, so...
9, 19, and
So 30...
18, 37?
Yeah, 37 million still untagged.
Well, you're saying 6, but it's really 8.
Right.
True. It's really...
Right.
Yes.
6 now and 2 later.
Yeah,
Right,
so
but it's 8.
It's 8.
Yeah, so 35 million.
Can I ask a question? You know, I know that there's, as you said, buckets. And I have a question. I know there are some rules for buckets and what you can spend in this bucket and you can't spend on another. Like, you know, a building bucket you can't spend on a salary bucket or something like that. So this bucket that you would take this money from, could it be used for instruction? Could it be used for, is there a limit to what it can be used for?
So,
in other words.
Yes, I understand. So the local capital projects fund, Fund 529, that is the funding source for that came from the general fund. We transferred money in there at the end of various fiscal years. And so that money can be used for any legal expenditure of the school district. Okay. We wouldn't want to pay necessarily the salaries out of 629, but we could transfer that money back to the general fund and fund salaries there.
Okay.
It's the bond money, the portion that we're paying the $59 million out of for all four, that has more restrictions on it.
Okay. Got it.
The difference there, though, that's really important about versus salaries versus one-time expenses. So when you're spending money for projects, those are one-time expenses. So you won't be increasing your operating every year because of using that money. When you commit, for example, to something like a salary increase, that means that you're committing to that salary increase every year versus a one-time expense. So what we're talking about here is a one-time expense. So there's different considerations that we have to put in play whenever we're talking about one-time expenses versus salary increases and operating expenses that will be incurred every year for the forever. That's the difference in terms of thinking, right? Yeah.
However, we did have to go into our general fund to fund the $6 million for raises
Right.
this past year. So
Right.
if we get to a point where we don't consider a TRE or a TRE doesn't pass, then we are to further provide that would have to look for one of these buckets to fund that as well.
Right. So all I was pointing out is just the difference between recurring expenses as we're thinking about spending versus one-time expenses that
Gotcha.
are not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the money in Fund 629, our local capital projects fund, is not an ongoing source. That money
Right,
came from the
right,
general fund
right,
originally, so we could not go to that well. We could go to that well once.
And that's the fund that we have used to pay for classroom additions and smaller scale throughout
Yes.
years when we aren't in a bond cycle per se,
Correct.
which is that's
Or things that
historically
weren't,
what we've used it
or
for.
things that weren't covered in the bond, weren't, you know,
So,
part
so
of the project.
bottom line, to get to Ms. Patterson's question, you think there's roughly about $35 million sitting in various reserve funds after covering this cost, and then before we get into the 3 months of unassigned fund balance. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
And again, as you and Ms. Patterson pointed out, not, you know, taking into account, you know, we don't know what else is going to pop up in
Sure.
the future, but
Yeah.
we know this need now.
Right. Right. Okay.
One more question.
One more.
When we add classrooms, is there a so many million per classroom space if we think of a Pierce or an elementary school?
I have a spreadsheet where I've broken down our per classroom cost, and I cannot reply it to you at the moment. I'll send it to you though. I've tracked that over the years.
Do you remember any of the recent ones that we've done where, oh, this number of classrooms
I
has
hate
cost
to lie
us
to
this
you.
many million? No? Thank you.